He was standing at the altar in his wedding suit, 300 guests watching, the music playing, the flowers perfect, when he said two words that stopped the entire garden cold. Not, "I do." What he said instead, and who he chose instead, would make every single person in that garden cry, including people who had not cried in years. This is that story. Edward Blackwood was 34 years old on the morning of his wedding day. He stood at the bathroom mirror in his enormous bedroom and looked at his own face for a long time. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, broad shoulders inside a crisp white shirt his valet had ironed the night before and hung carefully on the back of the door. He looked exactly like what he was, a powerful, wealthy, successful man who had everything the world said a man should want. So why did his chest feel so empty? He splashed cold water on his face and told himself it was just nerves. Normal wedding day nerves. Every man felt this way. He dried his face and walked to the window. His home, and calling it a home was generous, it was really more like a palace, sat on 2 acres of land in the most expensive part of the city. The garden below was already being prepared by a small army of workers in white uniforms. White flowers everywhere. Long tables covered in white cloth. A giant arch wrapped in roses standing at the far end where the ceremony would happen in a few hours. A red carpet ran from the gate all the way to the altar, as if royalty were expected. 300 guests were coming. Business people, politicians, celebrities, people whose names appeared in newspapers, people who would take photographs and share them everywhere so the whole world would know that Edward Blackwood had gotten married today. Edward watched the workers below and tried to feel something. He thought about Monica. They had been together for 4 years. She was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that made strangers stop and stare. She was sharp and she knew how to move through important rooms and say the right things to the right people. She never embarrassed him. She was always perfectly dressed, always perfectly spoken, always exactly what was needed in any situation. Edward told himself this was love. Or close enough to love. He had decided a long time ago that the real kind of love, the deep, terrifying, completely open kind, was not for him. Not anymore. He had tried it once. He had given his whole heart to one person without holding anything back at all. And she had taken that heart and destroyed it. Or so he had believed. He turned away from the window and began to get dressed. He did not think about Felicia. He never let himself think about Felicia. He was getting married today and everything was going to be fine. Down the hall in the biggest guest suite in the mansion, Monica Adams had been awake since 5 in the morning. Not because she was nervous. Monica was never nervous. Nervousness was for people who were not sure they were going to win. Monica was always sure. She sat at her vanity table in her silk robe while her makeup artist moved carefully across her face with a small brush. 3 other women were in the room with her. A hair stylist, a dress stylist who was steaming the wedding gown in the corner, and her personal assistant Ruth, who stood near the door with a clipboard, quiet and ready to fix any problem that came up. The room smelled of roses and expensive perfume. Monica stared at her reflection and thought about how far she had come. She had not grown up poor, but she had not grown up rich either, somewhere in the middle. Her father had been an accountant. Her mother had been Margaret. And Margaret, more than anything else in Monica's life, had made her exactly who she was. Margaret Adams was not like other mothers. Other mothers told their daughters things like work hard, be kind, find someone who loves you for who you are. Margaret told Monica different things. She told her the world was a competition and only the smartest players won. She told her that beauty was a tool, useful, but only if you knew how to use it. She told her that feelings were expensive and mostly useless, and that the cleverest thing a woman could do was choose her goals carefully, plan everything quietly, and never let emotion get in the way. Monica had been an excellent student. By the time she was 16, she could walk into a room and immediately know who had power, who wanted it, and who was only pretending. By 18, she knew exactly the kind of life she wanted, and she was already working on how to get it. Then at university, she had seen Edward Blackwood. She had known who he was before she ever spoke to him. Everyone did. He was the Blackwood heir. Quiet, serious, a little guarded, but with a kind of presence that filled the room without trying. She had watched him carefully for weeks before making her first move. But then something unexpected happened. Before Monica could get close to him, Edward had fallen for someone else. Felicia. Monica's jaw tightened slightly under the makeup brush and the artist said softly, "Please keep still, ma'am." Monica relaxed her face and smoothed her expression back to calm. Felicia. Plain, simple, scholarship student Felicia with her worn-out shoes and her second-hand textbooks and her big brown eyes that Edward could not stop looking at. Monica had watched the two of them together and felt something she did not have a name for at the time, something hot and sharp that sat deep in her chest and refused to leave. Later, she understood it was rage. And rage, her mother had always taught her, was just energy waiting to be used. Margaret Adams arrived at the mansion at 8 in the morning, exactly as planned. She was 60 years old, but she carried herself like a woman who had never once doubted herself in her life. Silver hair, gray eyes, a cream-colored dress that was elegant without trying too hard. She moved through the busy corridors of the mansion with a small, satisfied smile on her face. The smile of a person watching a plan they set in motion a very long time ago finally reach its end. She knocked twice on the door of Monica's suite and entered without waiting for an answer. "You look perfect," she said, standing behind Monica and examining her reflection. "I know," Monica said. "Don't cry during the ceremony. It smudges everything and makes you look weak." "I won't cry." Margaret lowered her voice even though there was no one nearby who could hear. "Once you've signed, it's over. Everything is yours. Nothing and nobody can undo it." Monica met her mother's eyes in the mirror. Between them passed the kind of look that didn't need words. The look of two people who had worked toward the same thing for a very long time and were finally standing at the finish line. "Yes, Mother," Monica said. Margaret nodded once, then turned to look out the window at the garden below. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was under control. She liked things under control. She was very, very good at keeping them that way. At the front gate of the mansion, a woman sat on the ground. She was thin. Her clothes were old and faded. Her feet were bare and dirty, her shoes having fallen apart weeks ago. Her hair was uncombed. She had a small plastic bag beside her that held everything she owned in the world. She had been sitting there since before sunrise, when the city was still dark and quiet. Her name was Felicia. She was 32 years old, though she looked older. The streets do that to a person. They take the softness out of your face and replace it with something harder. But if you looked carefully, past the dust and the tired eyes and the worn-out clothes, you could still see something in her face that the years had not been able to take away. A kind of quiet, determined strength. Something that was still alive in her even after everything. She watched the long black cars pulling through the gate one by one. She watched the guests stepping out in their fine clothes, laughing and greeting each other. She watched the guards at the gate, checking names off a list before letting each person through. Her name was not on any list. But she had to get inside. She had to speak to Edward Blackwood before this wedding happened. She had been trying to build up the courage for 3 days. She had walked across most of the city to be here. Her feet were sore and her stomach was empty, but none of that mattered right now, because Felicia knew something that nobody else in that mansion knew. Something that had been buried for 10 long years under money and lies and the cold, careful planning of people who believed they had gotten away with everything. She had the proof. And today was the only day it still mattered. She stood up, picked up her small plastic bag, and walked to the gate. One of the security guards stepped in front of her immediately, a large man in a black uniform who looked at her the way many people looked at her these days, not with cruelty exactly, but with the flat, tired look of someone who had already decided what kind of person they were dealing with before hearing a single word. "I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood," Felicia said. Her voice was quiet, but she kept it steady. "Mr. Blackwood is getting married today. He's not available. Please just pass a message. Tell him someone from Greenfield University is here. Tell him it's urgent. He will want to know." The guard looked her up and down slowly. Then he shook his head. "You need to move away from the gate, please, ma'am." His voice dropped to a warning. "Move away from the gate now or I'm calling the police." Felicia stood still for one long moment. Through the iron bars she could see the white chairs being filled with guests. She could see the flower arch at the end of the red carpet where Edward would soon be standing. She stepped back, But she did not leave. She sat back down on the ground beside the wall, just out of the guard's direct sight. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and waited. She would find another way. She always found another way. Thomas was looking for his phone. He patted his jacket pocket, his trouser pockets, the small table by the window. Nothing. He was Edward's best friend, had been since they were both 11 years old and sitting next to each other in school because their last names both started with B. He was shorter than Edward, with a round open face that was almost always smiling. He was wearing a gray suit and had already loosened his tie even though it was barely 8:30 in the morning. He stepped out into the corridor and nearly walked straight into a young kitchen worker carrying a tray. "Sorry," he said, steadying the tray. "No, sir, I'm sorry," the young woman said, and then she hesitated. "Sir, I don't know if I should say anything, but there's a woman at the front gate. She's been there since before sunrise. The guards keep sending her away, but she keeps coming back." Thomas frowned. "What does she want?" "She says she needs to speak to Mr. Blackwood. She looks like she's been living on the streets for a while. The guards didn't take her seriously, but I heard what she said before they pushed her back." "Sir," the young woman paused, "she mentioned Greenfield University." Thomas went very still. Greenfield University. That was where Edward had studied. That was where, a long time ago, everything had gone so wrong. A cold, quiet feeling moved through his chest. "Where is she now?" "Still outside the gate, sir. She won't leave." Thomas straightened his jacket. "Don't say anything to anyone," he said quietly. "I'll go myself." He walked down the long corridor toward the front of the mansion, his footsteps quick and purposeful, the cold feeling in his chest growing with every step. Thomas walked out of the mansion's front door and down the long driveway toward the gate. The morning sun was already warm on his face. Around him, staff members hurried back and forth, carrying flowers and folding chairs and boxes of things he couldn't identify. Nobody paid him any attention. Everyone had their own job to do this morning. He reached the gate and looked through the iron bars. She was sitting against the wall just to the right, small, thin, her knees pulled up to her chest, her head slightly bowed. She had a plastic bag next to her that looked like it weighed almost nothing. Thomas cleared his throat. The woman looked up. For a moment, Thomas just stood there. He had not seen Felicia in 10 years. 10 years was a long time, long enough to change a person so completely that you might walk past them on the street and feel nothing but a vague, unsettled feeling, like you had forgotten something important but couldn't remember what. But Thomas remembered. He remembered her laugh. He remembered the way she used to sit cross-legged on the grass outside the university library with 3 textbooks open at the same time. He remembered how Edward used to look at her like she was the most interesting thing in any room she walked into. He remembered the morning everything fell apart. He stared at her now and felt something twist painfully in his stomach. The woman looking back at him through the gate had Felicia's eyes, the same shape, the same quiet intelligence behind them. But everything else had been worn down by time and hardship. Her cheeks thinner, her skin duller, her whole body folded in on itself in the careful way of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. "Felicia," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, almost a whisper. She blinked. Then something moved across her face, surprise, relief, and something else. Something guarded. "Thomas," she said softly. They looked at each other through the bars of the gate for a long, heavy moment. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "Since before the sun came up." Thomas looked back toward the mansion, then back at her. His mind was moving quickly, turning things over. He thought about Edward inside, getting dressed. He thought about Monica in her wedding gown. He thought about 300 guests who would start arriving in earnest within the hour. He thought about how Edward had been for the past 10 years, successful, respected, always composed, and underneath all of it, somehow never quite whole. "I need to speak to him," Felicia said. Her voice was quiet and steady, but there was an urgency underneath it, pressed down tight. "I know today is the worst possible day. I know how this looks. But Thomas, I have something he needs to see before this wedding happens." Thomas studied her face. In all the years he had known Edward, he had watched his friend slowly close himself off from the world, one lock at a time, one wall at a time. He had watched him choose Monica, not with joy, not with the nervous, lit-up energy of a man in love, but with the calm, careful logic of a man who had decided that safety was the best he could hope for. Thomas had never fully believed the story about Felicia's betrayal. Not completely. Something about it had always sat wrong with him, too neat, too convenient, too perfectly timed. But he had been young, and Edward had been so certain, and there had been no proof of anything else. Until now, maybe. Wait here, Thomas said. He turned and walked back toward the mansion. Getting Felicia through the gate turned out to be easier than Thomas expected, mostly because he said nothing to anyone and simply opened the small side entrance himself, waving off the guard who started to protest with a look that said very clearly, "I am the groom's best friend and I am not in the mood." He led her quickly along the edge of the garden, away from the main areas where the staff were still setting up, keeping to the path that ran alongside the tall hedge. Felicia walked beside him in silence, her bare feet on the smooth stone path. He noticed the way she moved, carefully, quietly, like someone who had spent years trying not to be seen. He brought her to a small sitting room at the back of the mansion. It was a room for family, not used for events, not on the tour of the house that Edward gave important guests. Just 4 walls, a sofa, a low table, and a window that looked out over the side garden. "Sit," Thomas said gently. "I'll get you something." He came back with a glass of water and a small plate of bread that he had quietly taken from the kitchen without explaining himself to anyone. He set them on the table in front of her. She looked at the bread for a moment, then she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. He said simply, "Then tell me everything." She told him. She spoke quietly and without stopping, her hands folded in her lap. She told him about the morning she had woken up in her boarding house room 10 years ago to find a strange man in her bed, a man she had never seen before, who she later understood had been put there while she was asleep. She told him how Edward had arrived minutes later, how the boarding house owner had already called him, how it had all been arranged like a stage play with everything in place before she was even awake. She told him about being thrown out of her room, about her money disappearing, savings she had been building since she was 16, kept in a small tin under her bed, gone. About trying to reach Edward and being blocked at every turn, her messages never getting through, her phone calls never answered. She told him about Monica, how Monica had played the part of the devastated best friend perfectly, how she had stood beside Edward, held his hand, and shaken her head sadly whenever Felicia's name came up. She told him about the years after. The jobs she couldn't keep because she had no address. The shelters that were full. The people who helped sometimes and the people who didn't. The slow, grinding process of a life being dismantled piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. Thomas sat across from her and did not say a word. His face was very still, but his hands resting on his knees were tight. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," Thomas said. His voice was rough. "Felicia, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," she said. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here because of this." She reached into her plastic bag and pulled out a small flash drive. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment before setting it on the table between them. 3 days ago, she said, I was outside a cafe on Carter Street. Monica and her mother were sitting at a table near the window. I was going to walk away. I always walk away when I see them, but something made me stop that day. I stood outside and I listened. Thomas looked at the flash drive on the table. They talked about everything, Felicia said. Freely. Like people talk when they're completely sure nobody is listening. The staged betrayal. The man they paid to be in my room. The boarding house owner who took the bribe. My money. All of it. She paused. They laughed about it, Thomas. They sat there with their coffee cups and they laughed. Thomas closed his eyes for 1 second. There was a security camera above their table, Felicia continued. I went inside after they left. I found the waiter who managed that section. I told him what I had heard and I asked if the camera recorded audio. He checked. She nodded at the flash drive. Everything is on there. Their voices are clear as anything. Every word. Thomas reached out and picked up the flash drive. He turned it over in his fingers slowly. Have you listened to it? For times, Felicia said. I wanted to be sure I wasn't imagining things. She stopped, took a quiet breath. I've been alone with this for a long time. I needed to be sure. Thomas stood up. He paced to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the side garden. Outside, he could hear the sound of more cars arriving. Voices, laughter, the string quartet starting to warm up near the fountain. The wedding was moving forward. The ceremony was less than 2 hours away. He turned back around. I have to show Edward, he said. Felicia nodded slowly. I know it's going to. He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because there was no clean way to finish it. What he meant was, it's going to break him. Not because of Monica. He had never believed Edward truly loved Monica, but because Edward had spent 10 years believing a lie. 10 years building walls around himself, deciding he was someone who couldn't trust his own heart. 10 years of quiet, disciplined, hollow safety. All of it built on a foundation that had never been real. Are you ready for what happens after this? Thomas asked her. Felicia looked at him steadily. Her voice, when she answered, was soft but completely certain. I've been ready for 10 years, she said. Thomas found Edward in the dressing room on the second floor. Edward was standing at the mirror, adjusting his tie for what looked like the 4th or 5th time. His jacket was on, his shoes were on. He was completely dressed and completely ready, and yet he was still standing there adjusting the tie like he was looking for something to do with his hands. Thomas closed the door behind him. I need to show you something, he said. Edward looked at him in the mirror. The ceremony starts in less than 2 hours, Thomas. I know. Whatever it is, Edward. Thomas's voice was quiet but firm, the kind of quiet that stops a person. Sit down. Something in Thomas's face made Edward stop. He turned around slowly and looked at his friend. Really looked at him. Thomas was not a man who alarmed easily. He was the kind of person who stayed calm in difficult situations, who made jokes when things got tense, who kept the mood light. But right now there was no joke on his face. No lightness at all. Edward sat down. Thomas pulled the chair close and sat across from him. He set the flash drive on the small table between them and placed his phone beside it. He had already connected the two in the sitting room downstairs and loaded the audio file. Before I play this, Thomas said, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Edward said nothing, which was his way of saying go ahead. Do you remember Felicia? The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Edward's face didn't change, not exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted. A door that was usually kept firmly shut moved slightly on its hinges. Why are you asking me that? Edward said. His voice was carefully even. Because she's here. A long pause. What do you mean she's here? She's downstairs in the back sitting room. Thomas kept his eyes on Edward's face. She's been at the gate since before sunrise. She walked across the city to get here, Edward. Edward stood up. Then he sat back down. Then he stood up again and walked to the window. He stood with his back to Thomas, one hand pressed flat against the window frame. Outside, the garden was filling up. The guests were arriving in greater numbers now. The chairs were almost full. Everything was white and bright and perfectly arranged. 300 people gathering to watch Edward Blackwood begin the next chapter of his life. She betrayed me, Edward said. His voice was low. Did she? Edward turned around. I saw it, Thomas. I was there. You saw what someone arranged for you to see, Thomas said carefully. Just, please, before you say anything else, just listen to this. He pressed play. The recording was not long. Maybe 4 minutes. But 4 minutes was enough. The sound quality was good. The cafe had installed new cameras with audio only 3 months earlier, one of those small business decisions that nobody thinks twice about at the time. The voices were clear. There was the soft background noise of a cafe, cups, distant conversation, smooth music, and over all of it, 2 voices that Edward knew. Monica's voice first, light and amused. She actually came back to the city. Can you believe that? After everything. Then Margaret's voice, dry and unbothered. It doesn't matter. There's nothing she can do. There's nothing she can prove. She looked terrible, Monica said, and there was a smile in her voice. I saw her outside that restaurant on Wednesday. She didn't see me. She's been on the streets for years by the look of it. Good, Margaret said simply. A brief pause, the sound of a cup being set down. Then Monica, almost fondly, Do you remember how easy it was? We didn't even have to try that hard. The boarding house owner was cheap, Margaret said. 2,000 and he didn't ask a single question. The man we hired was even cheaper. And she slept right through it. Monica laughed softly. And Edward, he was so ready to believe the worst. That's the thing about people who love too hard. One little push and the whole thing collapses. That was the point, Margaret said. I knew exactly how to push him. Her money was the cleanest part, Monica said. Once she had nothing, there was nowhere for her to go. No way to fight back. No way to reach him. She had no family with money, no connections, nothing. Margaret's voice was completely without feeling, the way you might discuss clearing a table. Without resources, a person simply disappears. That is how the world works. And now, Monica said, and her voice lifted with satisfaction, in 3 days I'm going to be Mrs. Blackwood. Yes, Margaret said. You are. The recording ended. The room was completely silent. Thomas looked at Edward. Edward was sitting completely still in the chair. He had not moved for the last 2 minutes of the recording. His hands were resting on his knees and his eyes were fixed on a point on the floor somewhere between his feet. His face was doing something complicated and painful, the face of a man trying very hard to hold something together that is falling apart faster than he can manage. Edward, Thomas said softly. Nothing. Then a long, shaking breath came out of Edward slowly, like air leaving something that had been under pressure for a very long time. He pressed one hand over his eyes. Thomas waited. He did not say anything. Some moments don't need words, and he knew this was one of them. He just sat there, close, the way a good friend sits, not trying to fix anything, not looking away. After a while, Edward lowered his hand. His eyes were dry, but they were red. And the thing that had always been in them, that careful, composed distance, that locked-away quality, was gone. Completely gone. He looked, for the first time in a long time, like a person without any armor on. She was telling the truth, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, Thomas said. She always was. He closed his eyes. And I didn't believe her. I didn't even let her speak. I was so sure. I was so certain I knew what I had seen and I just... His voice cracked slightly on the last word and he pressed his lips together hard. Thomas said nothing. He just waited. Where is she? Edward asked after a moment. Downstairs. The back sitting room. Edward nodded very slowly. He stared at the floor for another few seconds and then he stood up. He straightened his jacket. He took one careful breath. Thomas watched him and thought, this is the bravest thing I have ever seen him do. Not the business deals, not the boardrooms, not the confident public face he wore every day of his life. This, standing up to walk toward the hardest thing. This was the brave part. Come with me, Edward said quietly. Thomas stood up and followed him out of the room. The back sitting room was exactly as Thomas had left it. Felicia was still sitting on the sofa. She had eaten the bread. The empty glass was on the table. She had her hands folded in her lap and she was looking at the window when the door opened. She turned. Edward stepped into the room and stopped. They looked at each other. 10 years is a long time, long enough to change almost everything about a person. And yet, there are things that don't change. The way a person holds their shoulders. The particular stillness they have when they are trying to be calm. The shape of something in their eyes that belongs only to them, that no amount of time or hardship can fully erase. Edward knew her. Despite everything, despite the years and the worn clothes and the difficult roads written across her face, he knew her. The way you know a song you haven't heard in a decade. The way you know a place you grew up in, even when all the buildings have changed. He took 2 steps forward and then stopped, like his legs had forgotten what to do. Felicia watched him. She did not stand up. She had imagined this moment many times over the years, had played it out in her mind in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes she was angry, sometimes she was cold, sometimes she said everything she had always wanted to say. In exactly the right words. But now that it was actually happening, all of those imagined versions disappeared. She just sat quietly and waited. Felicia, Edward said. His voice was very low and very rough. Hello, Edward, she said. He crossed the room in 3 quick steps and went down on one knee in front of her. right there in his wedding suit on the floor, and he bowed his head. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came out broken and simple and completely without decoration. The way an apology sounds when it is real. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you. I should have believed you." He stopped. His shoulders dropped. "I failed you. In every way a person can fail someone. I failed you. And I am so sorry." The room was very quiet. Felicia looked down at the top of his bowed head. She thought about all the years, all the cold nights, all the times she had wanted to give up and had found, somehow, some small reason not to. All the time she had wondered if the truth would ever find its way out into the light. She reached out and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "I forgive you," she said softly. "I forgave you a long time ago, Edward. It wasn't your fault. You were deceived. We both were." He looked up at her then. His eyes were wet. She looked back at him steadily. And for a moment, just a moment, it was as if the 10 years folded up and moved aside, and underneath them, still there, still alive, was the thing that had existed between them before anyone destroyed it. Thomas, standing quietly near the door, looked at the ceiling and blinked hard several times. Nobody said anything for a little while. Edward stayed where he was, kneeling, and Felicia kept her hand gently on his shoulder, and the room held all of it, the weight of 10 lost years, the relief of truth finally spoken out loud, the quiet and complicated feeling of two people finding each other again on the strangest possible morning. Then from somewhere outside the window, the string quartet began to play. A soft, elegant piece of music, the kind chosen for wealthy weddings, designed to float across a garden and make everyone feel like they were inside something beautiful and important. It drifted into the room through the glass, delicate and completely unaware of everything happening on the other side of the wall. Edward stood up slowly. He straightened his jacket, that same automatic gesture, hands smoothing the lapels, but this time it meant something different. This time it looked less like a man preparing a mask and more like a man preparing himself for something real. He looked at Felicia. She looked back at him. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Her voice was calm. She was not asking him to do anything, not pushing. She genuinely wanted to know. And whatever his answer was, she seemed prepared to accept it. That, Edward thought, was exactly like her. That had always been exactly like her. "I'm going to finish this," he said quietly. Felicia nodded once. Thomas stepped forward from the doorway. "The ceremony starts in just over an hour," he said carefully. 300 people are sitting in that garden, Edward. Monica is upstairs in her dress. Margaret is... "I know," Edward said. "I just want to make sure you understand what walking back out there means." "I understand." Thomas studied his face for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they have decided to trust someone completely. "All right," he said. "Then I'm with you. Whatever happens out there, I'm with you." Edward looked at him with an expression that said more than any words could manage. Then he turned back to Felicia. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Just stay in this room until Thomas comes for you. Don't leave. Can you do that?" Felicia looked at him steadily. "I've waited 10 years, she said. "I can wait 1 more hour." Edward did not go back upstairs to the dressing room. Instead, he walked through the quiet back corridor of the mansion, past the kitchen where staff were moving quickly with trays and glasses, past the small chapel room his mother had used for private prayer, past the portrait of his father hanging in the long hallway. A tall, serious man in a dark suit who looked very much like Edward, except with a warmer expression around the eyes. Edward stopped in front of the portrait for a moment. His father had been a man who believed in certain things absolutely. He had believed in honesty even when it cost something. He had believed that the way a person behaved when it was difficult was the only version of them that truly mattered. He had told Edward this many times in different ways throughout his life. "It's easy to be good when it's easy," his father used to say. "The test is whether you can still be good when it's hard." Edward looked at his father's painted eyes for a few seconds. Then he walked on. Edward walked out into the garden. The sun was high and bright, and the white flowers seemed to glow in it. 300 guests turned to look as he appeared, and a soft murmur of appreciation moved through the crowd. The string quartet shifted into the processional music. Everything was exactly as it had been planned, beautiful, expensive, perfectly arranged. Edward walked down the red carpet toward the flower arch at the end. His face was calm. His steps were steady. Nobody watching him could have known what was happening inside him. The recording still playing in his memory, Felicia's voice, the 10 years, his father's portrait in the hallway. He carried all of it quietly, the way he had always carried difficult things, and he took his place beneath the arch and stood facing the crowd. Thomas stood beside him as best man. He glanced at Edward once, a quick sideways look. Edward gave the smallest nod. Thomas let out a slow, careful breath. Then the music changed. Monica appeared at the far end of the red carpet and the crowd responded the way crowds always do when something genuinely beautiful appears before them, a soft collective intake of breath, followed by warmth. People leaned toward each other. People smiled. Phones came up to take photographs. She walked slowly, holding her bouquet of white roses, her head held high, her eyes fixed on Edward at the altar. She looked magnificent. The crystals on her dress scattered light across everything around her as she moved, so that she seemed to bring her own glow with her. Margaret sat in the front row on the bride's side, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression composed and satisfied. She watched her daughter walk down the aisle and felt the deep private pleasure of a plan arriving at its destination. Monica reached the altar. She stood across from Edward and looked at him with her beautiful practiced smile, warm and confident and certain. The priest stepped forward. He was an older man with white hair and a calm, carrying voice, the kind of voice built for large outdoor ceremonies. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Edward James Blackwood and Monica Claire Adams in holy matrimony. The garden was perfectly quiet. Even the birds seemed to have paused. The priest spoke for a few minutes about commitment, about partnership, about the weight and the gift of choosing one person above all others. Edward stood still through all of it, his hands at his sides, his eyes straight ahead. Monica watched him. Something was slightly off. She had felt it since the foot of the stairs, since that brief exchange in the entrance hall. But she told herself she was imagining things. She told herself he was nervous. Minutes it would all be done and nothing could be undone. Finally, the priest turned to Monica. "Monica Claire Adams," he said, "do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold, in joy and in sorrow, for as long as you both shall live?" Monica turned to face Edward fully. She looked into his eyes and she lifted her chin slightly and she said, clearly and confidently, so that the whole garden could hear, "I do." A gentle warmth moved through the crowd. The priest turned to Edward. "Edward James Blackwood," he said, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold, in joy and in sorrow, for as long as you both shall live?" The garden waited. 1 second passed. Then another. Edward looked at Monica. He looked at her carefully, the way you look at something for the last time, not with cruelty, but with the quiet finality of a decision that has already been made. Then he said, in a clear and steady voice that carried to every corner of the garden, "I don't." The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then the garden erupted. 300 people moved and gasped and turned to each other all at once, a wave of shock rolling from the front rows to the back like wind moving through tall grass. Someone near the middle dropped their program. An elderly woman in the third row said what out loud. 2 journalists near the back straightened up so fast they nearly knocked their chairs over. Monica stood completely still. Her bouquet of white roses was gripped in both hands and her knuckles had gone pale. The smile was gone from her face, wiped away in an instant, replaced by something that was trying very hard to look composed and not quite managing it. "Edward," she said. Her voice was low and tight. "What are you doing?" Edward did not answer her. He turned to the crowd instead and raised his voice so that everyone could hear him clearly. "I apologize to every one of you for what you are about to witness," he said. "I know you came here expecting a wedding. I know this is not what anyone planned. But there is something that needs to happen here today, something that cannot wait, and I ask you to please stay in your seats." He turned toward the side entrance of the garden, the small gate in the hedge that led back toward the house. He nodded. Thomas had gone inside 10 minutes before the ceremony began. Now he appeared at the side gate with Felicia beside him. He had found her a pair of simple flat shoes from somewhere, One of the household staff had given them without being told why, and someone had brought her a glass of water and a clean cloth. But beyond that, she was exactly as she had come. The old clothes, the thin frame, the quiet, careful way she moved. She walked through the gate and into the garden. The murmuring in the crowd changed. It shifted from confusion into something else, a different kind of noise, lower and more unsettled. People strained to see. People whispered to the person next to them. A barefoot woman in worn clothes was walking across the red carpet of Edward Blackwood's wedding, and nobody in that garden could understand what they were looking at. Monica's eyes found Felicia immediately. Something moved across her face, fast like a shadow, and then she controlled it, but it had been there. Margaret in the front row had gone very still. Felicia walked forward and stopped beside Edward. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at Edward, and he looked at her, and for just a moment it was as if the 300 people in the white chairs and the string quartet and all the flowers did not exist at all. Then Edward turned back to the priest. "I'm not going to marry Monica Adams today," he said. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man states a fact he is completely sure of. Then he turned to the crowd again. "But before I say anything else, I need you all to hear something." He looked toward the back of the garden where a large screen had been set up between two tall poles, usually used for displaying photographs during the reception. He caught Thomas's eye. Thomas, standing near the audio equipment table, pressed play. Monica's voice came out of the speakers first. She actually came back to the city. Can you believe that? After everything. Then Margaret's voice. "It doesn't matter. There's nothing she can do. There's nothing she can prove." Every person in that garden heard it. The speakers were good, the same ones hired to carry music across the large space, and they carried the voices clearly all the way to the back rows. "She looked terrible. I saw her outside that restaurant on Wednesday. She didn't see me. She's been on the streets for years by the look of it." Monica's face had gone pale, not the pale of shock, the pale of something being found out. She turned toward the speakers the way a person turns toward a sound they had hoped never to hear. "Do you remember how easy it was? We didn't even have to try that hard. The boarding house owner was cheap. $2,000 and he didn't ask a single question. The man we hired was even cheaper. And she slept right through it." There was a sound in the crowd now, a low continuous sound, the sound of 300 people reacting in real time. People were leaning forward. People had stopped whispering. Everyone was listening. And Edward, he was so ready to believe the worst. That's the thing about people who love too hard. One little push and the whole thing collapses. That was the point. I knew exactly how to push him. Her money was the cleanest part. Once she had nothing, there was nowhere for her to go. No way to fight back. Without resources, a person simply disappears. That is how the world works. And now, in 3 days, I'm going to be Mrs. Blackwood. You are. The recording ended. The garden was absolutely silent. Monica moved first. That's been edited, she said. Her voice was bright and firm and urgent. She turned to the crowd. That recording has been tampered with. You can do anything with audio now. You can make anyone say anything. Monica. Edward's voice was quiet. She made this up. This woman showed up today and she made this up because, Monica. He said her name again and something in the way he said it made her stop. He looked at her steadily. I recognize your voice, he said simply. I have heard your voice every day for 4 years. That is your voice. Monica stared at him. Then she looked at the crowd, at 300 faces looking back at her. Some of them were people she had known for years. Business contacts, family friends, people whose respect she had spent a long time carefully building. She looked at all of them looking at her, and she saw in their faces the thing she had always feared more than anything else in her life. She saw them letting go. This is not fair, she said. Her voice cracked slightly, and it was the first completely real sound she had made all morning. I have worked for this. I have given everything. You took everything, Edward said. From her. He looked at Felicia. And now the guests looked at Felicia too. Really looked at her, at this thin woman standing on the red carpet in worn-out clothes, standing quietly with her hands at her sides. And something happened in that garden. The way things sometimes happen in large groups of people when the truth arrives all at once and lands on everyone at the same time. A woman in the fourth row began to cry. Then another. Then a man near the back cleared his throat roughly and looked at the ground. In the front row, Margaret Adams sat with her hands still folded in her lap and her face perfectly controlled. She stared straight ahead and said nothing. And the controlled stillness of her face was somehow the most damning thing in the entire garden. Monica looked at her mother. It was a desperate look, the look of a person who had always had someone to tell them what to do next, searching for instructions. But Margaret did not look back at her. Margaret kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, as if by staying still enough, by being controlled enough, she could somehow remain untouched by what was happening around her. Monica was on her own. She turned back to the crowd one more time. She opened her mouth, but whatever she had been about to say seemed to dissolve before it reached her lips, because the faces looking back at her had changed. The warmth that had been there when she walked down the aisle, the admiration, the smiles, the phones raised to capture her beauty, all of it had shifted into something cooler and more careful. People were not cruel. Nobody shouted. Nobody stood up. But the withdrawal was total and quiet and completely devastating. The way a tide goes out, not dramatically, just steadily, until all that is left is bare ground. Monica Adams had spent her whole life understanding power. She knew better than almost anyone what it looked and felt like. And she knew, standing at that altar in her designer dress with her perfect hair and her white roses, that power had just left the room. She set the bouquet down on the small table beside the priest. She set it down carefully, neatly, as if even now, some part of her could not stop performing. Then she walked back down the red carpet alone, her crystals still scattering light across everything around her, her chin still up, her steps still measured. She did not look at Felicia as she passed. She walked through the main gate of the garden and out of sight. After a moment, Margaret stood up from the front row. She smoothed her cream dress with both hands, looked at nobody in particular, and walked the same way her daughter had gone, unhurried and upright, as if she were simply leaving early by choice. The garden watched them go in silence. The priest, to his considerable credit, cleared his throat gently and looked at Edward. Edward was still standing beneath the flower arch. He had not moved through any of it. He stood now with his hands at his sides and looked at the space where Monica had been. Then he turned and he looked at Felicia. Felicia was looking back at him. She looked the way she had looked in the sitting room earlier, steady, quiet, without performance. She had not watched Monica walk away. She had not looked at the crowd. She had simply stood and waited, the way she had always waited, with a patience that had cost her more than anyone in that garden could fully understand. Edward took 2 steps toward her. "I told you I was going to finish this," he said softly, so that only she could hear. "But there's something else I need to say." Felicia waited. "I wasted 10 years," he said. "I know I can't give those back. I know saying sorry again doesn't fix what those years cost you. I'm not standing here asking you to forget any of it." He paused. "But I'm standing here asking you for a chance. Not today. I know today has been too much already. Just a chance. Whenever you're ready. If you're ever ready." Felicia looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, 300 people sat in complete silence, barely breathing, as if the whole garden understood that it was holding something fragile and important and did not want to disturb it. The corner of Felicia's mouth moved. Not a full smile, something quieter than that. Something that had been buried for a long time and was only now, carefully, beginning to find its way back to the surface. "You always did talk too much when you were nervous," she said softly. A short, surprised breath of laughter came out of Edward, unexpected, completely real, the laugh of a man who had not laughed like that in a very long time. Thomas, standing off to the side, pressed his hand over his mouth and looked at the sky. Edward turned to face his guests. He looked out at 300 people, some still tearful, some stunned, some watching with the quiet, moved expression of people who have just witnessed something they will be thinking about for a very long time. "I owe all of you an explanation," he said. "And I owe this woman far more than an explanation." He looked at Felicia beside him. "Her name is Felicia. 10 years ago, she was the most brilliant, the kindest, and the most genuine person I had ever met. She was also the person I loved more than I had ever loved anyone. She was taken from me through lies and cruelty, and I was too blind and too proud to question what I had been made to see. He stopped for a moment. She has spent 10 years on the streets of this city because of what was done to her. While I built a life, she lost everything she had. She had no money, no support, and no one who believed her. And yet she came here today not to ask for anything, not to take revenge, but simply because she believed the truth deserved to be heard. His voice was steady but thick. That is the kind of person she is. That is the kind of person she has always been. The woman in the fourth row was crying again. She had given up trying to stop. A man near the back began to clap. Then another person. Then 3 more. Then the clapping spread, quietly at first, and then growing until the whole garden was filled with it. Not the sharp celebratory applause of a party, but something slower and more serious. The kind of applause that means we see you and we are sorry and you deserved better than this world gave you. Felicia stood on the red carpet and heard 300 people clapping for her. She looked straight ahead and her eyes filled with tears for the first time all morning. She did not try to stop them. She just let them come, and she stood tall while they did, because she had earned every one of them. Thomas walked over and stood beside her on one side. Edward stood on the other. In the weeks that followed, many things changed. The recordings spread quickly, as recordings do in a world where information moves faster than morning light. By the evening of the wedding day, it had been heard by thousands of people. By the following morning, hundreds of thousands. Margaret Adams found that the careful, powerful network of connections she had spent decades building had a very short memory when it came to loyalty. Phone calls she made went unanswered. Invitations she sent were quietly declined. The world she had constructed through strategy and control began, brick by brick, to dismantle itself. Monica left the city. Nobody announced where she went, and after a while, nobody asked. Edward moved slowly as he had promised. He found Felicia proper housing first, a clean, quiet apartment in a good part of the city, arranged through Thomas with no conditions attached. He told her it was hers regardless of anything else. He told her it was the least that was owed. He set up a small fund to cover whatever she needed while she rebuilt, not as charity, he was careful to say, but as a debt being repaid, because that was what it was. Felicia accepted it with the same quiet dignity with which she accepted everything. She did not make it easy for him to feel forgiven too quickly, and he did not ask her to. He simply showed up, carefully, consistently, without pressure, and let time do what only time can do. They had coffee for the first time 3 weeks after the wedding, at a small cafe on the opposite side of the city from Carter Street. They talked for 2 hours about ordinary things: books, the city, a film that had just come out, a news story they had both read. At the end of it, Felicia laughed at something he said. A real laugh, easy and unguarded. And Edward thought it was the best sound he had heard in 10 years. He did not tell her that. Not yet. But Thomas, who had insisted on sitting 2 tables away just in case he was needed for moral support, noticed the look on Edward's face when it happened. He paid his bill quietly, stood up, and walked out of the cafe with a wide smile that he let nobody see. 6 months later, on a quiet Saturday morning with no guests and no flowers and no red carpet, Edward Blackwood and Felicia sat together on a bench in a small park near her apartment. He had not planned what he was about to say. Or maybe he had been planning it for 10 years without knowing it. I meant what I said at the wedding, he told her. I'm not asking you to forget anything. I'm not asking you to rush anything. He looked at the park in front of them. The trees, the path, the ordinary Saturday morning people walking their dogs and pushing strollers. I'm just asking if you'll let me try properly. The way I should have tried a long time ago. Felicia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, I used to think that if I ever got the truth out, if anyone ever believed me, that would be enough. That would be all I needed." She looked down at her hands in her lap, the same hands that had once held textbooks and had once been rough and calloused and were now slowly becoming something in between. But the truth came out, and I found out it wasn't quite enough on its own. Edward looked at her. "What else did you need?" he asked. She looked up at him. And there it was again. That quiet, unlocking thing in her expression that had first appeared on the red carpet and had been growing steadily ever since. "This," she said simply. The park was ordinary and unhurried and full of regular Saturday morning sounds. Nobody was watching. Nobody was taking photographs. There was no altar, no arch, no string quartet, no crowd. Edward reached over and took her hand. She let him. And that was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything. Sometimes the truth takes 10 years to arrive. But it always arrives. And when it does, when it finally walks through the gate, barefoot and tired and still standing, the only thing left to do is open the door. Where are you watching from today?